13 through the remainder of this chapter. Ecclesiastes Chapter 7, and beginning with verse 13. It says, "Consider the work of God, for who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider. God also has set the one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. Be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldst thou destroy thyself? Be not over much wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldst thou die before thy time? It is good that thou shouldst take hold of this, yea, also from this withdraw not thine hand, for he that feareth God shall come forth of them all. Wisdom strengtheneth the wise more than 10 mighty men which are in the city. For there is not a just man upon earth that doeth good and sinneth not. Also take no heed unto all the words that are spoken, lest thou hear thy servant curse thee. For oftentimes also thine own heart knoweth that thou thyself likewise hast cursed others. All this have I proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? I applied mine heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, and to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. And I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands. Whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. Behold, this have I found, saith the preacher, counting one by one to find out the account, which yet my soul seeketh, but I find not. One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those have I not found. Lo, this only have I found, that God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions." Now again, as we look and consider the sayings here of Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes, it is at a time toward the end of his life, and we had pointed out earlier on, Solomon did not always behave himself wisely or righteously, and God rebuked him because of his sin. He had allowed women to draw him away from the Lord and into idol worship, and God foretold that he would take the kingdom from him, but not in his lifetime. Solomon is looking back over his life and kind of looking at it and considering it in the light of the things that God has revealed to him. And it is looking at the life and man is under the sun. That is the reoccurring phrase. That is, from a human perspective, from what we can see under the sun. And he does mention many times God's perspective, but for the most part, it's the perspective. He sees things under the sun, and that's the way we observe things. Apart from the grace of God, and apart from the wisdom that he gives us through the Scriptures, through what he reveals to us, these are some observations that we might make as well. And we want to keep that in mind as we read through here. But as he does, as he's considering mankind, as he considers our lives as they're lived out under the sun, not only his own as he's looking back over his life that he's lived out here in the flesh on this earth, this life, but the lives of many others as he's observed. Solomon is an observer. He's kind of a people watcher. And many of the things he discusses here is things that he has observed not only in himself, but in others. And so he begins here with verse 13. And I believe this kind of sets the tone for the remainder of this chapter. He says, consider the work of God. He says, for who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? In other words, whatever God has purposed to do, he's going to do it. Whatever he has done or has purposed to do, man's not going to change it. And we see man constantly struggling, it seems like, to try to thwart or change the will of God, the mind of God. And we see this expressed in a lot of different ways. In the scriptures, in the prophets, woe unto them that call evil good and good evil. What is that? Man wants to change what God has said. Well, God says this is sin. Man wants to change it. Said, no, that's not sin. That's not evil. That's good. That's what we ought to do. And that which God has said, this is righteous. And man said, I don't want to do that. So that's evil. And we see that even in our land today, in the laws that are being passed, where man is trying to turn around what God has said. And there are many examples. Just one of them is that about marriage. They want to redefine marriage. God has already defined what marriage is, but man is wanting to redefine it. And I think that's one of the things he's saying here is man many times seeks to, but this is foolishness. This is vanity to think that we can change that which God has purposed. Also, as we look at our lives and God's hand in our lives, a lot of times we look at ourselves and think, well, I wish I was taller. I wish I had different color hair. I wish I had different, we always look at somebody else and say, oh, that person is beautiful. That person is handsome. I wish I could be more like them. But God has made you the way you are. And he's done so on purpose. And just so many ways that people, even in aging, and I can kind of identify now, but you see people go to great expense, put themselves and their bodies through all kinds of torture, just about, to try to look younger, to try to hang on to their youth, and so on. In some ways, the lifestyles that people choose ages them a lot quicker. And if they had lived a more godly lifestyle, they wouldn't have aged so badly. But be that as it may, we see over and over again this attitude of mankind, seeking to change that which God has made. And Solomon, in his wisdom and his observation, saying, you need to stop and consider and think about that. He said, you're not going to do it. We read in Isaiah 46, and this has been one of my favorite verses of Scripture. It seems like I'm constantly coming back to and quoting this. But in verse 9, Isaiah 46:9, remember the former things of old. In other words, you go back, kind of like what's on. Consider. You look back in the past and see all the things that God has done. You know, and in speaking to Israel, through all their history that's recorded up through here, and God bringing them out of Egypt, and the plagues on Egypt, the crossing the Red Sea, all the things that God has done, all the way up to this time that Isaiah is writing, a time in which the people have forgotten God, and they've gone to idol worship, and they've been disobedient to God, and he's reminding us, if you go back and look at all the things that God has done in the past. You know, and all the mighty works he's done, and what he's done when people have rebelled against him. And Korah there, and the earth swallowed him up, and all that appertained to him, all those that died of the different plagues upon Israel when they was in the wilderness, because they murmured and complained and rebelled against Moses. You know, you go back and remember and consider all these things. He says, remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Calling a ravenous bird from the east, the man that executeth my counsel from a far country. Yea, I have spoken it, I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it, I will also do it. You know, and that's kind of what I see Solomon saying. Consider the work of God. Said you can't change it. If he's made something crooked, you're not going to make it straight. Or it's vain, it's empty to try to change it. And that's his, you know, his outlook on that. Man, apart from God and apart from the grace of God, our life spent here under the sun is full of vanity. It is empty. It is fruitless apart from God. Isaiah 14, verse 27. Says, for the Lord of hosts hath purposed, and who shall disannul it? And his hand is stretched out, who shall turn it back? Now, you're not going to change those things that God has purposed to do and that which he's done. And so, verse 14, he's saying now, and he's again encouraging us, those who will be reading this, to consider these things. That in the day of prosperity, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, consider. You know, it's natural that when things are going good, when you're prospering and everything's going good, to rejoice in that and to be glad in it. Said, but you're also going to encounter days of adversity. And he says, so think about that. Be prepared for it. You know, we did a study on the book of Job. What was it? Job said, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. You know, he told his wife, said, look, we've received good from the hand of God. When we receive bad from his hand, because it all comes from God, said, are we going to complain? We didn't complain when we received good. Are we going to complain when we receive bad? Because it comes from the same source. And so, I'm sure Solomon had read the book of Job by this time, because it says, you know, he collected wisdom. He collected these wise sayings. He was a collector and a student of wisdom and all these things. And so I'm sure he was familiar with the book of Job. And so he's saying here, you know, in the day of prosperity, be joyful, but in the day of adversity, consider. God also has set the one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him. God set one over against the other. And likewise, when lays upon someone a certain adversity or infirmity or something, then he compensates that as well. We had that visitor came by the other day that as a very young child had spinal meningitis? And so his left side, his left arm and his left leg were messed up. So he couldn't do all the things that most people can do, but he has compensated. The Lord has blessed him in other ways and given him talents. Let's think of Ronnie Wolf. He was had polio as a young boy, and to this day, then he wears the metal braces on his legs and uses those crutches to get around. But God's blessed him with a talent in playing the piano and different things, and it's called him to preach. And so God has a way of balancing things out. He balances out the bad with good, and sometimes he balances out the good with bad. He gives us adversity as well. Paul says, I've learned how to abound. I've learned how to be abased. I've learned that in whatsoever state I'm in to be content therewith. And matter of fact, he tells us, he describes there in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, how that God had given him a thorn in the flesh. But there was a reason for it that Paul mentions here in verse 7. Because prior to that he's talking about, and I believe he's talking about himself. I believe he's referring to the time when he was stoned and drugged outside the city and left as dead at the side of the road. And it would appear that during that time, he was ascended up into heaven and saw things in heaven. He said things that, can't be uttered. He said, verse 2, chapter 12, verse 2, 2 Corinthians, I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth, such a one caught up to the third heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. How that he was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such a one will I glory, yet of myself I will not glory, but in my infirmities. And now he goes on to explain this, verse 7. And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations. I think he was talking about himself. He said, I knew a man. And I believe he was talking about himself because he goes on, how that he would glory in his infirmities. And he says here, lest I should be exalted, there was given unto me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And so we see how God had blessed Paul with a great knowledge, revelations, these things. And Paul saying, I could get full of pride over that. I mean, it would be natural for a man to having experienced that and seen things and been exposed to things and heard things that nobody else has ever seen or heard, and then come back to the earth. He said, I could have gotten puffed up in pride, and probably would have. That's the reason God knew him, and he gave him this thorn in the flesh to keep him humble. And even though Paul desired the Lord to take it away from him, when God said no, said, I've done this on purpose. There's a reason for it, and my grace is sufficient for you. And then Paul does an about face and says, well, I'll glory in my infirmities then, Because when I'm weak, when I realize I'm weak, I depend on the Lord that much more and on His grace. And then I'm strong. And so he learned to depend on the Lord for that. And I think when he made those statements, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He's coming back to this. My grace is sufficient for thee. And so Solomon has seen this. He has observed this, that there is a certain balance in our lives, and that these are the things of God. And we're not going to alter them, and we need to learn to accept these things for God has purposed to do it. We may not understand it. And I think Solomon goes on to say, some of these things, the things of God and His eternal purpose, they're beyond even Solomon's capacity to seek out and to understand. So there are things that we have to take on faith. There are things that we cannot understand. And he goes on and in his observations along those same lines, he says here, all things have I seen in the days of my vanity. He said, man, I've seen everything. And he was in a position, as we've commented before, that God had blessed him. There was a time of peace. He had no enemies. He had no one that he had to fight and go to war against. He was blessed with great wealth and given wisdom. And so he used that to pursue a lot of things. And he had opportunities to observe people, other kings and rulers and those who labored for him and workers. And he saw all sorts of the whole spectrum of humanity. As we said, he was a people watcher. He was an observer. God had given him wisdom, and even in his own foolishness, he retained his wisdom and could look back and see where he had made mistakes, and as he observes others and what was going on. And God, through him, is giving us the benefit of that experience. And what a blessing that is, if we would take heed to it and allow God to teach us these things. He can teach us things about life before we encounter them, and give us wisdom to avoid the snares and the pitfalls and the wiles of the devil and these things, and avoid many of the mistakes that would bring us into sorrow and distress, if we would be wise enough, as Solomon says, to consider and to think about these things. So all things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. This goes back to some of the things again that we studied in the book of Job, that Job puzzled over. So I see a lot of parallels here between what Solomon is saying and what Job observed and the conversations there. That there is in this life sometimes what appears to be an inequity, an injustice. In a right world, those that do good would be blessed, and those that do evil would be punished. But it doesn't always work out that way in this life. Now, there will be a time of judgment. And I think this is what Solomon is saying. We might, under the sun, we may observe people that live and do right and die, maybe even an early death. Whereas someone that does wickedly and prolongs his life in his wickedness. And we think, man, that's just not right. That's messed up. Someone that lived that wickedly and he seems to continue to prosper. Where is the justice in that? The justice will come before the great white throne of judgment, when all things will be revealed and all things will be made known. He goes on in verse 16, be not righteous over much. Now, I've got some thoughts and notes here, and he may be referring to the idea that people, again, we're looking at human nature here, and the tendency of people in trying to be righteous and do right, and it becomes ritualistic. And their heart's not really in it. They go through the motions. That was the problem of the Pharisees. They were a righteous people, and they believed in keeping the law. Paul said of himself, as touching the law, blameless. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He was a law keeper. And yet, he says, their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me. They draw nigh to me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And that was the problem with the Pharisees' attitude and heart. Paul says, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved, for I bear them record. They have the zeal of God, but it's not according to knowledge. And so that would appear to be what he's saying. Don't be so focused on doing that you lose sight of the why, and your heart's not in it. That it doesn't just become a ritual that you do. And said, be not overmuch wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldst thou die before thy time? In verse 18, he kind of sums that up and brings us back to this thought. It is good that thou shouldst take hold of this. And he says, here's what I want you to get out of this. He goes back, verse 13, consider the work of God. In verse 14, in the day of adversity, consider, God also has set the one over against the other. God is working all things out according to the counsel of his own will. And we may not understand it all in this life. But he says this, yea, also from this withdraw not thine hands. Don't forget this. So, consider this, take a hold of this, don't let go of this. He that feareth God shall come forth of them all. Remember, he gets to the end of the book. His conclusion of the whole matter is this: fear God and keep his commandments. He's saying, I know there appears to be these inequities. The righteous man dies in his righteousness, and the wicked prolongeth, himself in his wickedness. And so there is this appearance of inequity and injustice. But remember, if you do that which is pleasing to God, fear God, those who fear God, that do right because it's the right thing to do in the fear of God, they will come forth of them all. And so we need to remember that there is, he asked, what profit is there in all the labor that we do under the sun? He said, well, this I've seen. This you need to take a hold of. And don't ever forget. They that fear God will come forth of them all. He says, wisdom strengtheneth the wise more than 10 mighty men that are in the city. And he goes on to say that, we talk about the righteous man, but he says, the reality of it is there's none righteous, there's none that doeth good, no, not one. We have all sinned and come short of the glory of God. All of our righteousness in the sight of God is as filthy rags. We don't know. The man may appear to be righteous. He may appear to be a good man as far as we know, but we don't know his heart. The Bible says there's none good, no, not one. Paul quotes this over in the But let's see. I got a little ahead of some of my thoughts here, but I wanted to look in Acts 15:18. I was back on the thing that God, in His wisdom, we were reminded of God's sovereignty and His wisdom. Acts 15:18, known unto God are all His works from the beginning of the world. In Romans 8:28, we like to read and quote, we know all things work together for good to those who love God, who are the called according to His purpose. All things, we see verse 15, he said, have I seen. One of the things that he's saying here in these verses, we get down verses 19 through 23. He says, don't take yourself too seriously. There's never been and never will be a perfect man. The only perfect man was Jesus, who is the God-man. We've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. And one of the things that he mentions here, he says, also, take no heed unto all the words that are spoken. Now, you hear a lot of things said. And then it would appear here that he's talking about, don't try to eavesdrop and hear what everybody's saying. You might hear something you don't really want to hear. You might hear them saying something negative about you. It's kind of the gist of it. So kind of be careful. It's not always wise to hear everything that is being said around you. And he said, you might just hear somebody cursing you. That really upset you, wouldn't it? You heard somebody talking bad about you behind your back, and you would get upset. But he said, but now think about it. So in your heart, you've done the same thing to others. How many times, the Scripture teaches us, over in the book of James, about the tongue. And we need to learn, by God's grace, to bridle the tongue. It is a very unruly member. And so we need to be careful. Not only should we need to be careful what we say, don't take what other people say too seriously. Don't let it eat at you. Don't get all upset with what other people say. Verse 23 said, all this have I proved by wisdom. That is, he's put it to the test. The things he's saying here, the conclusions he's come to, the things he's sharing with us, are things that he not only has observed, but he's kind of put it to the test. He's tried it. He's proved it. And using wisdom to discern the validity of the things that he is saying. In verse 24, that which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? I applied mine heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, and to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. I tried to observe all these things, and I wanted to know, I wanted to search out the why of these things. And again it comes, he'll bring this conclusion out here. He said, but in verse 25, I applied mine heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of all of things, and to know. And verse 26, He says, and I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands. Whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. He says, we need to be wary. As men, and I don't mean to be picking on women. And Solomon, I don't think he was just picking on them, but there is a saying, not a biblical or scriptural saying, but a kind of a common saying among people is, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. You get a woman mad, and so a lost person, a lost woman, is probably one of the meanest things you're ever going to encounter in the world. You get a lost woman mad. And Satan uses this, and so he says, whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her. So all through the book of Proverbs, we saw over and over again the warnings about the adulterous woman and the strange woman, and so on and so forth. And he goes on to say here, behold, this have I found, saith the preacher, counting one by one to find out the account. In other words, I took this step by step, item by item. I examined it to find out the sum of all of this. Which yet my soul seeketh, but I find not one man among 1,000 have I found. I don't know if that is, he's talking about a righteous man. As he says here, whoso pleaseth God. Whoso pleaseth God. He said, well, I found maybe 1 in 1,000. He says, but a woman among all those have I not found. But you go back and compare it. It didn't say there's not any, but it's rare. And that goes back to what he said in the book of Proverbs. A virtuous woman, who can find her? Her value is far above rubies. It's rare. It's precious. Because of the rarity of it, it is very precious. So there's nothing more precious than a virtuous, godly woman. And we are, that is set up as the example for us. And he said, when he said that in Proverbs about the virtuous woman, and he says she's very rare. And yet, he said there are many virtuous women in Israel. But his mother was the most virtuous of all. So they're rare, but you have to know where to look. You see. You don't go to the bars and the dens of the world to find a good woman. You want to find a good woman, you go to church. That's what he's saying, Eddie. Amen. Said they're rare. Virtuous woman is rare. But if you can find one, the value is far above rubies. He said there's many virtuous women in Israel. You just have to know where to look for them. God's people. And so he says here, verse 29, lo, this only have I found. He's all these things. Here's the one thing that I found. When you're going back and you're looking at the things that he said, that here's the righteous man that dies in his righteousness, the wicked man that prolongeth his days, goes through all these things. He said the bottom line here, God made man upright. but they have sought out many inventions. In other words, God created man in his image and likeness. He created man upright, but man sinned. Man rebelled against that and fell from that first estate. And so now he is depraved. And that's why we see all the inequity, all the injustice, all the wickedness and the things in this world under the sun is because of sin. God created man upright. And we've said before, and that is the standard to which God will hold man accountable. You know, people kind of shrug their shoulders and make the excuse, well, nobody's perfect. That's the problem. Because God created man upright. And his son Jesus Christ came into this world, made, born of a woman, in the flesh, without that sinful nature, and he kept the law perfectly. So there's no grading on the curve. God holds us accountable to that perfect standard of righteousness in which he created man. And so to say, well, nobody's perfect, that's the condemnation. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We're all under that condemnation. Apart from Christ and the grace of God to redeem us and to forgive us of our sins. And that's the reason he said over there, he that feareth God shall come forth of them all. So he said, you remember this. You remember, forget everything else, and you just remember one thing. Remember this: those that fear God and do that which is right in his sight, out of a reverence and fear for him, will come forth of them all. Let us close here this evening. Let's stand together. Hymn number 38. Farther along. This kind of goes along with this, our thought. There's a lot of things in this life we don't understand why they work out the way they do. But the Lord will make it plain when he comes. Hymn number